Picture this. The year is 371 BC, the battlefield of Leuctra. The Spartan war machine, dominant for generations, the most feared military force the Greek world has ever known, stands in perfect formation. Their red cloaks gleam in the summer sun. Their bronze shields shine like walls of fire. Behind them lies the weight of 300 years of victory, from Thermopylae to Plataea, from the Peloponnese to Asia Minor. But across the field, something impossible is about to happen. 300 men, not just soldiers, lovers, brothers in arms bound by something the Spartans could never understand. In less than an hour, they will do what no army in Greece has ever done. They will annihilate Sparta's finest, kill a Spartan king in open battle, and tear down a myth that has terrorized the Greek world for generations. This is the story of the Sacred Band of Thebes, the other 300, the warriors history tried to bury. Before we step onto the blood-soaked fields of Leuctra and Chaeronea, before we stand shoulder to shoulder with these men as they face impossible odds, take a second to arm yourself for the rest of this campaign. If you live for deep-dive battle breakdowns, forgotten units, and the brutal truth of how wars are really won and lost, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode of Wars in History. And if you want to see more stories like this, about heroes who refuse to fit the mold, drop a like and a comment to tell the algorithm this is the kind of history that deserves to be seen. Now, let's go back to where this began. To a Greece ruled by fear, to a city under occupation, and to a radical idea that love itself could be turned into a weapon. The early 4th century BC was a bleak afterimage of the so-called Golden Age. The Peloponnesian War had not just ended Athenian supremacy, it had broken the illusion that Greek cities shared any real unity when power was on the line. 27 years of siege, plague, and civil war had left scars in every polis, from the smallest village to the marble temples of Athens. When the last Athenian ships surrendered and the long walls were torn down to the sound of Spartan flutes in 404 BC, the message was clear: Sparta now ruled the Greek world. But Spartan rule did not look like the liberation many had once imagined. Spartan Harmist's military governors were planted like iron stakes across the Aegean, each backed by a garrison and a hand-picked oligarchic regime. In place of citizen assemblies and democratic debate came midnight arrests, show trials, and lists of enemies of order. In Athens, the 30 tyrants, propped up by a Spartan garrison, executed hundreds of citizens in a single year and exiled thousands more, confiscating property to reward their supporters. This pattern repeated itself in city after city. A minority of collaborators, a majority kept in line by fear and Spartan spears. Sparta's military reputation was not a myth pulled from thin air. From early childhood, Spartan boys were thrown into the agog decades of harsh training that crushed weakness and cultivated discipline, endurance, and absolute obedience. A Spartan citizen was a full-time warrior. He did not farm his own land. He did not trade. He existed to fight and to dominate others. Their hoplite phalanx, drilled to a level of precision no other city could match, had shattered enemies at Tanagra, at Plataea, and in countless lesser-known clashes. When a Spartan army marched, most Greeks did not think in terms of winning or losing. They thought in terms of survival or annihilation. By the 380s BC, Sparta had turned even diplomacy into a weapon. In 386 BC, the so-called King's Peace, guaranteed by the Persian king Artaxerxes II, forced the Greek cities to accept Persian control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor, while leaving Sparta as the guarantor of autonomy for the cities on the mainland. In practice, this meant Sparta had a free hand to break up leagues, topple governments, and punish any city that dared to organize without Spartan approval. They bullied Mantinea. They humbled Elis. They kept a close eye on Boeotia, the fertile central region, whose leading city, Thebes, had long been a potential rival. Thebes was not Athens. It did not have vast fleets or shining marble temples that poets wrote about. It was a land power, surrounded by smaller Boeotian cities, and for much of its history it had been overshadowed by its neighbours. But it was strategically vital. Boeotia controlled the main land routes between northern and southern Greece, and its plains could feed armies. During the Persian Wars, Thebes had chosen the wrong side, collaborating with the invaders, a stain that other Greek cities never forgot. Yet by the early 4th century, Thebes had rebuilt its strength, leading a loose Boeotian league and challenging Spartan influence in central Greece. That was a step too far. Sparta decided Thebes needed to be put in its place. In 382 BC, a Spartan commander named Phoebidus was marching north through Boeotia on a supposedly unrelated mission when an opportunity presented itself. Pro-Spartan oligarchs inside Thebes, eager to seize power, arranged for Phoebidus to accidentally occupy the Cadmea, the fortified citadel that dominated the city. Under cover of a religious festival, Spartan troops, invited in by traitors, seized the fortress without a formal declaration of war. The democratic leaders were exiled or arrested. A puppet regime was installed. Thebes, officially at peace with Sparta, had just been stabbed in the back. Even some Spartans were uneasy about the blatant illegality of the act, but the leadership in Sparta chose to ratify what had been done. The message was brutal and simple. No city was safe, treaty or no treaty, if Sparta decided it posed a threat. For ordinary Thebans, the occupation of the Cadmea was a daily humiliation. Every time they looked up at the citadel, they saw foreign spears on their own walls. Spartan garrison soldiers swaggered through the streets. The pro-Spartan rulers purged opponents, seized property, and sent messages of loyalty back to their overlords. But exile did not break the democratic faction. A group of Theban patriots, driven from their homes, found refuge in Athens, now a wary rival of Sparta once again. In cramped Athenian houses and dim corners of the agora, they whispered and planned. They knew that as long as the Cadmea remained in Spartan hands, Thebes was not a city. It was a hostage. One of those exiles was a man named Pelopidas. He was not yet the legendary general he would become, but he had already shown the qualities that would define him: personal bravery, deep loyalty to his city, and an almost reckless refusal to accept subjugation as a permanent condition. Pelopidas would become the charismatic face of Theban resistance. But Thebes would also need another kind of mind, a quieter one, more introspective, but capable of rewriting the art of war. That man was Epaminondas. Together these two would reshape the Greek world. Yet before they could do that, Thebes had to be freed, and for that someone had to walk into the jaws of the Spartan wolf. In the winter of 379-378 BC, the exiles decided to act. The plan was audacious: infiltrate Thebes in disguise, assassinate the leaders of the puppet regime in a coordinated strike, then, in the chaos, rally the citizens and seize the Cadmea before the Spartans could react. Failure meant torture and death. Success meant a free city, but only if the people were ready to rise. The exiles knew that years of occupation can break a city's will. They were gambling that Theban pride had not yet died. On a stormy night, Pelopidas and a small cadre of exiles slipped out of Athens, travelling in small groups so as not to arouse suspicion. They approached Thebes separately, disguised as hunters, merchants and travellers, bundled in cloaks to hide their weapons. Inside the city, a resistance network of trusted citizens had been quietly prepared, waiting for the signal. Pelopidas entered Thebes under cover of bad weather, heading for the house of a loyalist named Chaeronea, to be confused with the mythic boatman of the dead, though the symbolism was hard to miss. For a brief, agonizing moment, word spread that Charon might have betrayed them and sent word to the Spartan commander. If that rumour had been true, the exiles would have walked into a trap. It was not. Charon remained loyal. The plan went forward. The puppet leaders were hosting a drinking party when the assassin struck. Some of the exiles disguised themselves as women, veiled and wrapped, carrying concealed daggers. Others, dressed as servants, moved casually through the house. At a signal, cloaks were thrown off, voices were raised, steel flashed. The pro-Spartan oligarchs, drunk and unarmed, died in panic and confusion in their own homes. Outside, at prearranged points, Theban loyalists seized weapons and moved to key locations. At dawn, Pelopidas and his comrades appeared in the agora, no longer disguised, calling the people to arms. The exiles from Athens marched in openly now. Athens had quietly supplied support, including the general Chabrias with a small force. The city erupted. Ordinary citizens, farmers, craftsmen and merchants flooded into the square, furious and electrified. The Cadmea was still in Spartan hands, but for the first time in years the streets of Thebes belonged to Thebans. The Spartan garrison was now isolated, surrounded in a hostile city. The Thebans and their Athenian allies blockaded the fortress, cutting off supplies. Skirmishes flared around the walls. The Spartans held out as long as they could, but reinforcements were far away, and the political tide had turned. Under negotiated terms, the garrison finally surrendered and was allowed to withdraw. For Sparta, this was an embarrassment. For Thebes, it was a rebirth. In one winter strike, Pelopidas and his fellow exiled had overturned the occupation and made Thebes once again the centre of a resurgent Boeotian League. But liberation created a new, even more dangerous problem. Thebes had humiliated Sparta. That kind of insult could not be left unanswered. A counterstroke was inevitable. The liberated city now faced an angry superpower with a long memory. If Thebes wanted to survive, it needed something more than patriotic speeches. It needed an edge so sharp it could cut through Spartan bronze. Enter Gorgidas. The historical sources say relatively little about him, but what they do say is crucial. He was a Theban commander who understood both the brutal realities of hoplite combat and the deeper currents of Theban society. After the liberation, Gorgidas was tasked with organising Thebes' defences and consolidating the fragmented Boeotian League into a real military power. He knew that sheer numbers wouldn't save them. Spartan-led coalitions could outnumber Thebes in a full-scale war. He needed quality. He needed a unit that could stand in the front rank against Sparta's finest, and not just hold but break them. Greek culture, especially in places like Thebes, Athens and Elis, recognized and often idealized male-male relationships that combined mentorship, affection and eros. These bonds were thought to inspire virtue, self-control and courage. Philosophers like Plato speculated that an army made of lovers would be unstoppable, because each man would rather die than behave shamefully in front of his beloved. Where Plato explored the idea in dialogue, Gorgidas decided to test it in steel. Around 378 BC, he formed a permanent corps of 300 men, selected not by wealth or pedigree, but by physical excellence, martial skill, and proven bravery. Crucially, he chose them in pairs, 150 couples, each composed of two men already bound by a deep personal relationship. Ancient tradition and later sources describe these as lovers, not simply battle buddies. In a world where warfare was intimate, shields pressed together, spears thrust inches from faces, bodies crushed in the Orthismos Gorgidas wagered that no motivation would surpass the drive to protect, impress, and not fail the person you loved most. This was more than sentiment. It was weaponized psychology. In a typical Greek army, when a line began to waver, fear spread quickly. If one man dropped his shield and ran, those next to him might waver too, and a crack would open in the phalanx. Gorgidas's logic was ruthless. A man might abandon a stranger. He would not so easily abandon his lover. If he broke ranks and fled, he would not only doom his partner to death, he would have to live with the knowledge that the person whose opinion mattered most had seen him fail. That shame in a culture obsessed with honor could be worse than death. The new unit was named the Hieros Lokos, the Sacred Band. The name implied both a religious dedication and an elite status. They were housed together in the Cadmea, the very fortress once held by Spartans. Where Spartan soldiers had once looked down on a subdued city, now 300 Theban warriors trained, ate, and slept side by side, preparing for the day when they would meet Sparta in the open field. Their very existence was an act of defiance, a declaration that Thebes would win not by copying Sparta, but by doing something the Spartan system could never allow. The Sacred Band was a full-time professional unit, paid at public expense and kept under continuous arms. While many Greek hoplites were citizen farmers who returned to their land between campaigns, the men of the Sacred Band lived as permanent soldiers. Their days were consumed by drill and training. They practiced marching in step over uneven ground, maintaining tight formation even when turning or changing pace. They learned to keep shield edges overlapping perfectly so that the wall of bronze remained seamless under pressure. Their primary weapon was the doru, the 8 to 9 foot thrusting spear standard among Greek hoplites, and the heavy round hoplon shield made of wood and faced with bronze. Hours were spent drilling spear thrusts, shield pushes, and coordinated advances, withdrawals and wheeling maneuvers. In a world before firearms, endurance mattered as much as technique. Training included running in full armor, close-quarters sparring, and repeated formation charges designed to build the stamina needed to maintain cohesion through the exhausting grind of real battle. But the most important part of their training was not just physical, it was relational. Because they were paired lovers, they already shared trust that no ordinary comradeship could manufacture quickly. Gorgidas arranged the line so that partners fought side by side or very near each other in the files, allowing each man to see, or at least feel, that his beloved was still there. The units slept, ate, and worshipped together. Shared rituals, feasts, oaths, possibly dedications to Heracles, and other patron gods of strength and courage, reinforced their identity as a single sacred community. The Sacred Band also trained alongside other Boeotian contingents, acting as an example to stiffen the courage and discipline of less experienced troops. In early deployments, Gorgidas is said to have distributed the Sacred Band across the front line of the army, inserting pairs at key points to bolster local morale and stopping power. If a section of the line faced particular danger, you wanted one of these couples there, two men who would rather die than retreat. This dispersal built their reputation slowly, battle by battle, long before they became the concentrated spearhead Epaminondas would later use at Leuctra. To outsiders, this unit must have seemed strange, even unsettling. But results speak louder than gossip. When the Sacred Band entered the field, Theban commanders knew they had something no other city possessed: a corps of soldiers whose courage was not just drilled, but emotionally anchored, and very soon Sparta would get a first taste of what that looked like under pressure. Sparta could not ignore a liberated Thebes leading a revived Boeotian League. In 378 BC, King Agesilaus III led a major campaign into Boeotia, determined to smash Theban resistance before it could mature into a real threat. Agesilaus was no minor commander. He had fought in Asia Minor, humbled Persia's satraps, and spent decades honing his craft. His army, composed of Spartan citizens and allied contingents, marched into central Greece expecting another straightforward lesson in Spartan dominance. The resulting campaign was not a single, set-piece battle, but a series of maneuvers and clashes around Theban territory. In one of these engagements, Athenian general Chabrias, fighting alongside the Boeotians, made a move that would become famous. As the Spartan hoplites advanced in their usual disciplined formation, Chabrias ordered his men not to brace their spears and shields in the standard defensive stance, but to stand at ease, shields resting on knee or hip, spears held casually upright. It was an insult wrapped in calm. The message was, "We're not afraid of you." Gorgidas's Sacred Band, deployed with the Theban front line, mirrored this posture. For Spartans who lived off the aura of inevitability, this was a shock. Agesilaus, seeing a line of enemies so relaxed that they wouldn't even pretend to fear his charge, hesitated. To attack and lose would be catastrophic. To attack and win, but with heavy losses, would undercut the Spartan image of effortless superiority. In the end, he backed off. In purely tactical terms, the day was indecisive. Strategically and psychologically, it was enormous. A Spartan king had approached, looked into the eyes of Theban and Athenian soldiers who refused to cower, and chosen not to test them. For the Sacred Band, this was a quiet but crucial victory. Without fully realizing it yet, they had stepped into the role history was carving out for them, the men who did not flinch in the face of Sparta. Over the next few years, Theban forces engaged Spartan-led armies repeatedly in what is often called the Theban-Spartan or Boeotian War. Raids, ambushes, and small battles bled Sparta's resources and undermined its authority. The Sacred Band, still under Gorgidas's direction, fought in many of these actions, gaining experience and a sense of invincibility. Each time they held firm or pushed back a Spartan contingent, their legend grew among allies and enemies alike. Yet their true coming-out party, the first time they showed what 300 lovers could do when concentrated, was still to come. In 375 BC, word reached Thebes that a Spartan garrison was moving near the small town of TEGYRA in Boeotia. Pelopidas, who had by now taken over more direct command of the Sacred Band, decided to strike with a force that was, on paper, dangerously small. Accounts differ on exact numbers, but all agree the Theban detachment was significantly outnumbered by the Spartan force they encountered. Conventional wisdom said a smaller army should avoid open confrontation with Spartans. Pelopidas chose the opposite. He aimed straight for them. The two forces collided near a narrow pass flanked by marshlands and rough ground. The Spartans, seeing what they assumed was a reckless Theban advance, formed up with confidence, but Pelopidas compressed his line, placing the Sacred Band at the core and driving straight into the Spartan centre, instead of trying to match their width. In the melee that followed, the Spartans were shocked to find themselves pushed back. Both of their polemarchs, field commanders, were killed in the fighting. The Spartans broke. For perhaps the first time, a Spartan detachment in fair, open combat had been routed by a numerically inferior enemy. Plutarch later quotes Pelopidas as saying that, after TEGYRA, Thebans no longer believed Spartans were invincible in any number. The psychological tables were turning. Sparta could still field large armies and win campaigns, but the aura of automatic victory had been punctured. Everyone in Greece heard about TEGYRA. Everyone heard about the 300 Thebans at the heart of the charge. Gorgidas had forged the weapon. TEGYRA proved that it worked. Now it needed a wielder bold enough to use it not in a skirmish, but in a true showdown against the main Spartan army, led by a king on open ground. That wielder was Epaminondas. By the early 370s BC, the Sacred Band was no longer an experiment. They were battle-hardened veterans, the sharpest edge of a Theban army that had learned to adapt and innovate under pressure. Epaminondas, now a leading statesman and general, understood exactly what he had. He had a core of 300 professionals who would never break. He had a city that had tasted blood at TEGYRA and wanted more, and he had a rival in Sparta that, for the first time in centuries, was showing hairline fractures in its armour. The political situation in Greece had reached a boiling point again. The king's peace was fraying. Thebes insisted on representing the entire Boeotian League in diplomatic conferences, while Sparta sought to break that league apart by treating each city as separate. In 371 BC, at a peace congress in Sparta, Epaminondas refused to sign away Theban leadership in Boeotia. The Spartan king Agesilaus struck Thebes from the treaty list, effectively declaring that Sparta and Thebes were at war once more. Sparta dispatched King Cleombrotus Theo with a large army Spartan citizens, Peloponnesian allies, cavalry to march into Boeotia and crush this upstart power once and for all. Cleombrotus advanced through difficult terrain and emerged onto the plain near a small village called Leuctra. There he stopped and offered battle. It was a place with no grand temples, no epic legacy, just fields, low hills, and a road. Yet what would happen there would echo through every war that followed, from Philip and Alexander's campaigns to the tactics of modern generals. Epaminondas led the Boeotian army out to meet them, with Pelopidas commanding the Sacred Band. The Thebans were outnumbered. The Spartans had the prestige and the track record. A council of Boeotian generals debated whether to accept battle at all. Many argued for withdrawal into the safety of fortified cities. Epaminondas, with the future of his city and his friends in the Sacred Band on the line, argued for something else. Fight here, fight now, and break Sparta, or be broken trying. The decision came down to a single vote. 4 for battle, 3 against. Fate, and a razor-thin margin, committed Thebes to the gamble. The weapon Gorgidas had forged was about to be hurled directly at the heart of Spartan power. On one wing of the Theban line, 300 lovers tightened their helmet straps, checked the grips of their spears, and glanced sideways at the faces they knew better than their own. Ahead of them stood the greatest army in Greece. Behind them stood a city that refused to bow again. Between these two realities lay Leuctra, and at Leuctra the Sacred Band would either die or annihilate Sparta. By 371 BC, Thebes had not one but 2 military geniuses leading its armies. You already know Pelopidas, the daring commander who liberated Thebes, the charismatic warrior who led from the front, the man whose name alone could rally troops in the darkest moments. But standing beside him was another man, quieter, more philosophical, and arguably even more dangerous. Epaminondas. Born around 420 BC into an impoverished Theban family, so poor, ancient sources say, that he often went without proper clothing. Epaminondas was not your typical Greek general. He was not a product of aristocratic privilege or inherited command. He was a product of ideas. He studied under Lysis of Tarentum, a Pythagorean philosopher who had fled southern Italy and settled in Thebes. Lysis taught him mathematics, ethics, music theory, and above all, to see the world as a system of patterns and relationships. While other commanders memorized the traditional playbook of Greek warfare right wing strong, left wing weak, phalanx 12 ranks deep, charge and hope for the best, Epaminondas questioned everything. Why did armies always place their best troops on the right wing? Why did the phalanx always fight 12 ranks deep? Why did everyone follow the same predictable tactics that had been used for 200 years? Why, when facing a numerically superior enemy, did generals try to match their width and fight the same kind of battle? These were not rhetorical questions. They were the seeds of a revolution. Epaminondas was an idealist who believed in liberation, not conquest. He saw Spartan hegemony as an infection poisoning the Greek world, turning cities against each other, crushing democratic governments, and replacing Greek freedom with Spartan fear. He was determined to cut it out. But he was also a realist. He knew that courage alone would not defeat Sparta. The Sacred Band was formidable, 300 men who would never break. But 300 men could not win a war against 10,000. What he needed was a tactical breakthrough so radical, so unexpected, that it would neutralize Sparta's numerical and experiential advantages in a single, cataclysmic blow. And by 371 BC, after years of studying battles, terrain, and human behavior, he had it. The oblique order, a formation so revolutionary that it would change warfare forever. The idea was simple in concept but terrifying in execution. Refuse one wing entirely, hold back your center, and mass overwhelming force on a single point of attack. Hit the enemy's strongest wing with your strongest wing, but make your wing so deep, so heavy, so concentrated that it would punch through like a battering ram through a wooden gate. Kill the enemy commanders, shatter their best troops, break their morale, do it fast before your weaker wings collapse. It was all or nothing, victory or annihilation. There was no middle ground. Now all he needed was the opportunity to use it. Sparta was about to give them that chance. In the spring of 371 BC, representatives from the major Greek city-states gathered in Sparta for yet another peace conference. The endless cycle of wars was bleeding Greece dry. Armies marched and countermarched, crops were burned, cities were besieged, and nothing ever really changed. There was a desperate, exhausted hope that diplomacy could succeed where swords had failed. Athens was there, still wary of Sparta but no longer strong enough to challenge it directly. Sparta was there, arrogant and certain of its right to dictate terms, and Epaminondas represented Thebes and the Boeotian League. The negotiations seemed promising at first. A general peace treaty was drafted. One by one the city-states signed, Athens signed, Corinth signed. Even smaller cities desperate for a break from the constant threat of invasion signed. But when it came time for Epaminondas to sign, he did something that stunned the room. He insisted on signing not just for Thebes, but for the entire Boeotian League, the federation of cities in central Greece that Thebes led. It was a statement of unity and power. Thebes was not just another city-state. It was the leader of a league, and it demanded to be treated as such. Sparta's king, Agesilaus II, the grizzled veteran who had spent his life enforcing Spartan dominance, refused. He demanded that each Boeotian city sign individually, which would have effectively dissolved the league and stripped Thebes of its power. Epaminondas refused to back down. The room erupted into shouting. Voices echoed off the stone walls. Accusations flew. Agesilaus, his face red with rage, stood and struck Thebes from the treaty entirely. The stylus scratched across the wax tablet. Thebes was out. The conference collapsed. Diplomacy was dead. Sparta and Thebes were at war. Again! But this time Sparta was not going to play the long game. This time they were going to crush Thebes immediately before it could rally allies, before it could fortify, before it could become a real threat. King Cleombrotus the Young, camped with his army in Phocis to the northwest of Thebes, received orders to march immediately. No delay, no negotiation. Crush them. Cleombrotus commanded a massive army, approximately 10,000 Spartan and Peloponnesian hoplites, plus 1,000 cavalry. Among those hoplites were 700 full Spartan citizens. Spartiates, the elite warrior caste trained from childhood in the Agog, the brutal system that turned boys into weapons, and protecting the king himself were the hippies, the royal bodyguard of 300 picked Spartans, the best of the best. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were the heirs of the men who stood in the front rank at Thermopylae. These were the descendants of the warriors who had broken Athens and humbled Persia. This was not a raid. This was not a punitive expedition. This was an army built to annihilate. Cleombrotus marched southeast through the mountain passes, his army a river of bronze and red cloaks flowing down into Boeotia. He entered the plain of Leuctra in southern Boeotia, a flat stretch of farmland between low hills, perfect for hoplite warfare. There, on ground that favoured his tactics and his numbers, he deployed his army in the traditional Greek battle formation and waited. Sparta had never lost a pitched battle on open ground in living memory. Not against Athens, not against Corinth, not against Thebes. Cleombrotus was confident. The Theban upstarts were about to learn what happened to cities that defied Sparta, when news reached Thebes that a Spartan army was marching toward them. Panic set in. The Theban leadership, the Boeotarchs, the elected generals who commanded the army and directed policy, held an emergency council. The situation was grim. They could muster only 6,000 to 7,000 Boeotian hoplites, and many of those were from allied cities whose loyalty was questionable at best. Some of these cities had been bullied into the Boeotian League. Others were hedging their bets, waiting to see which side would win before committing fully. The Thebans were outnumbered, outmatched, and facing the most feared army in the world. Some of the Boeotarchs argued passionately for retreat. Avoid battle. Fall back into the fortified cities. Let Cleombrotus ravage the countryside and hope that Sparta's allies would grow tired and go home. It was the safe choice, the logical choice, the choice that would save lives in the short term. But Epaminondas argued against it with every ounce of persuasion he possessed. He told the council that if they ran now, the Boeotian League would collapse. Their allies would abandon them. Thebes would be isolated, besieged, and eventually destroyed. But if they stood and fought, if they faced Sparta on the field and won, they would shatter the myth of Spartan invincibility forever. They would prove that courage, discipline, and tactical brilliance could defeat even the greatest military machine the Greek world had ever known. The vote was taken. It was 4-3. 4 generals for battle, 3 for retreat. By a single vote, Thebes chose to fight. By a single vote, the fate of Greece was decided. If that vote had gone the other way, there would be no Battle of Leuctra, no Theban hegemony, no liberation of Messenia. Sparta would have remained the dominant power in Greece for another generation. But the vote went for battle, and Epaminondas, with Pelopidas at his side, began to prepare. On a summer morning in 371 BC, the Theban army marched out to the plain of Leuctra. The sun rose over the hills, burning away the morning mist, revealing the Spartan army across the field. The sight must have been terrifying. a wall of bronze shields and crimson cloaks stretching across the plain. Thousands of men in perfect formation, silent and still, waiting. The Spartans did not shout or boast. They did not need to. Their reputation did the work for them. But Epaminondas had a plan, and Pelopidas had 300 men who were ready to die to make it work. The stage was set. The most important battle in Greek history was about to begin. Greek hoplite warfare in 371 BC followed rules that had been unchanged for centuries. It was a ritualized, almost choreographed form of combat. Armies lined up opposite each other in parallel phalanxes, typically 8 to 12 ranks deep. Each man wore a bronze helmet, a bronze cuirass or linen corselet, bronze greaves on his shins, and carried a heavy round shield called a hoplon, and an 8-foot spear called a doru. The best troops were placed on the right wing, the position of honour, because the right side of the formation tended to drift rightward during the advance, as each man sought the protection of his neighbour's shield on his unprotected right side. The two phalanxes would march toward each other, close to within a few dozen yards, and then charge. They would crash together shield to shield in a brutal grinding collision called the othismos, the push. Men in the front ranks stabbed over the rims of their shields with spears, aiming for throats, faces, and the gaps in armour. Men in the rear ranks pushed forward with their shields, adding their weight and momentum to the mass. It was not graceful. It was not romantic. It was a shoving match with spears, where men were crushed, trampled, and stabbed in the press of bodies. Whichever side's formation broke first would rout, and the slaughter would begin as the victors chased down and killed the fleeing enemy. It was bloody, predictable, and Sparta almost always won because their warriors were simply better trained, more disciplined, and more experienced than anyone else. Epaminondas looked at this system and decided to break every single rule. First, instead of placing his best troops on the right wing, he massed them on the left, the traditionally weaker wing. This was insane by Greek standards. The left wing was where you put your less experienced troops, your allies, your second-tier soldiers. But Epaminondas put his sacred band there, along with the best Theban hoplites. Second, instead of forming his phalanx 12 ranks deep, he stacked his left wing 50 ranks deep. 50! It was an absurdly deep formation, a human battering ram with crushing mass when it hit. The men in the back would push the men in the front forward with irresistible force. The men in the front would be unable to retreat even if they wanted to. Third, he held back his centre and right wings in a staggered echelon formation, angling them progressively backward so they would engage the enemy later, or ideally not at all. The entire plan hinged on his left wing led by Pelopidas and the Sacred Band, at the very tip of the spear smashing through the Spartan right wing and killing King Cleombrotus before the weaker Theban centre and right collapsed under Spartan pressure. It was a race, a gamble, a calculated risk that defied every convention of Greek warfare. If the Sacred Band failed, if they were stopped or slowed, the entire Theban army would be encircled and destroyed. But if they succeeded, if they broke through and killed the Spartan king, they would decapitate the Spartan command structure and break their formation in one overwhelming blow. This was the oblique order, and no one in the Greek world had ever seen anything like it. Epaminondas was betting everything on one punch, one overwhelming, concentrated blow to the enemy's strongest point. It was madness, it was genius, and it was about to be tested. The battle began not with the phalanxes, but with cavalry. Both armies sent their horsemen forward to skirmish and disrupt the enemy line. This was standard procedure in Greek warfare. Cavalry would probe, harass, and try to create openings for the infantry to exploit. but the quality of the cavalry on both sides was wildly different. Theban cavalry had been improving steadily over the past decade. They had trained hard, learned from their mistakes, and were now among the best in Greece. The Spartan cavalry, by contrast, had been neglected. Sparta's warrior culture glorified the hoplite and treated mounted troops as an afterthought. They were poorly trained, poorly equipped, and poorly motivated. When the two forces collided in the centre of the plain, the Thebans drove the Spartan horsemen back in a chaotic rout. The Spartans broke and fled, panicking, crashing back into their own infantry lines. Horses reared and screamed. Riders fell or were thrown. The neat Spartan formations, which had been attempting to shift and adjust to counter the strange Theban deployment, were suddenly disrupted by their own fleeing cavalry. Men stumbled, files were broken, officers shouted orders that were drowned out by the chaos. King Cleombrotus, trying desperately to restore order and shift his right wing forward to meet the threat he could now clearly see coming, lost precious seconds, and Epaminondas, watching from across the field, saw the disruption. He saw the moment. He gave the order. The Sacred Band, at the head of the 50-rank deep column, began to march. Imagine being a Spartan warrior in King Cleombrotus's elite hippies bodyguard. You have trained your entire life for this moment. You were taken from your family at age 7 and thrown into the agoge, where you were beaten, starved, and drilled until you became a weapon. You have fought in a dozen battles. You have never known defeat. Your red cloak and lambda emblazoned shield mark you as one of the finest soldiers on earth. You stand in the front rank, shield locked with your brothers, spear levelled, ready to meet the enemy. You see the Theban left wing advancing. At first, it looks strange. The column is impossibly deep, moving like a single monstrous organism. At its head are 300 men in perfect formation, shields locked, spears levelled. The Sacred Band. You have heard the rumours, lovers who fight like demons, men who will never retreat. But rumours do not stop spears. You brace yourself. Lock your shield with your brothers. Plant your feet. Breathe. And then they hit. The impact of the 50-rank Theban phalanx crashing into the 12-rank Spartan line was unlike anything anyone on that battlefield had ever experienced. The sheer mass and momentum were overwhelming. It was not a collision. It was an avalanche. Spartan warriors who had stood firm against 100 charges, who had pushed back Athenians and Corinthians and Argives, found themselves being physically driven backward. Their shields were crushed against their chests. Their feet lost purchase in the dirt. The ground was slick with dew and blood. Men in the front ranks of the Spartans, trapped between the advancing Thebans and the press of their own men behind them, could not move, could not fight effectively, could not even fall when they were wounded. They were held upright by the crush of bodies. The Sacred Band, fighting with superhuman ferocity, pushed into the Spartan formation like a spear point into flesh. Each pair fought as one organism. The older lover, the Erastes, would strike with his spear, and the younger beloved, the Eromenos, would cover him with his shield. If one man's spear broke, his partner would step forward to give him space to draw his sword. If one man was wounded, his lover would drag him back into the second rank, and another pair would step forward to fill the gap. They moved with a coordination that no amount of drill could create in ordinary soldiers. This was something else. This was men fighting for the person they loved more than life itself. Men screamed. Bronze scraped against bronze. Spears shattered. Shields cracked. The Spartans, disciplined and brave, fought back with everything they had. but they were being crushed by weight and numbers and sheer, unrelenting pressure. And at the very heart of the Spartan line, surrounded by his hippies bodyguard, King Cleombrotus fought desperately to hold his position. Cleombrotus knew that if he died, the battle was lost. A Spartan king did not retreat. A Spartan king did not surrender. A Spartan king stood and fought and died if necessary. That was the code. That was the expectation. He fought with the courage expected of a Spartan king, wielding his spear and shield with deadly skill, surrounded by the 300 finest warriors Sparta possessed. His bodyguard formed a wall around him, shields locked, spears jabbing at anyone who came close. For a moment it seemed like they might hold. But Pelopidas and the Sacred Band were not fighting for glory or honour. They were not fighting for fame or riches. They were fighting for the man beside them, for their city, for freedom, for the right to exist without bowing to Sparta. They pressed forward, step by step, killing every Spartan who stood in their way. The Spartan hippies, brave and skilled, began to fall. One by one, then in pairs, then in groups, the formation began to compress and buckle under the relentless pressure. And then, in the chaos of bronze and blood and screaming men, a Theban spear found its mark. Cleombrotus was struck. The spear punched through his armour, through muscle into his chest. He staggered, tried to stay on his feet, tried to keep fighting. His bodyguard desperately tried to drag him back to safety, forming a shield wall around their wounded king, but the wound was mortal. Blood poured from the gap in his armour, his vision blurred, his legs gave out. Within moments, Cleombrotus II, king of Sparta, was dead on the field of Leuctra. The psychological impact of the king's death was immediate and catastrophic. The Spartans, who prided themselves on discipline and courage, who'd been taught from childhood that they were invincible, had just watched their commander and symbol of power cut down in front of them. The hippie's bodyguard, the 300 finest warriors Sparta possessed, had failed to protect him. Panic began to ripple through the Spartan right wing like a wave. Men looked around, saw their king's body being dragged backward, saw the crimson cloak stained darker with blood, and felt something they had never felt before: fear. And the Sacred Band, sensing blood, pushed harder. They did not stop to rest. They did not pause to regroup. They pushed forward, shields locked, spears stabbing, trampling over the bodies of the Spartan dead. The Spartan formation shattered. Men who had never retreated in their lives, men who had been trained to stand and die rather than run, began to fall back. They tripped over the bodies of their fallen comrades. Shields clattered to the ground. The perfect formation, the unbreakable Spartan phalanx, broke. The myth of Spartan invincibility, forged over 3 centuries of warfare, died in less than an hour on a summer morning in Boeotia. With their right wing collapsing and their king dead, the rest of the Spartan army began to disintegrate. Epaminondas' centre and right wings, which had been held back deliberately, now surged forward, striking the exposed Spartan flanks and centre. The Spartan allies' troops from Corinth, Elis, TEGYRA, and other Peloponnesian cities who had never wanted this fight, who were here because Sparta demanded it, saw the elite Spartan warriors running and decided they wanted no part of this disaster. They broke and ran. The Theban cavalry, victorious in the earlier skirmish, now wheeled around and pursued the fleeing Spartans, cutting them down as they fled toward the hills. The slaughter was immense. Of the 10,000 men in Cleombrotus' army, approximately 1,000 were killed. But the numbers that mattered, the numbers that would echo through Greek history, were even more shocking. Of the 700 Spartan citizens who had marched to Leuctra, 400 were dead, more than half, in one afternoon, including the king, including the core of the royal bodyguard, including dozens of officers and veterans who represented decades of training and experience. Sparta, a state whose entire society was built around producing warriors, whose population of full citizens had been declining for decades, had just lost more than half its elite fighting force in a single afternoon. The surviving Spartan commanders, humiliated and broken, sent heralds to Epaminondas asking for a truce to collect their dead. This was the ultimate admission of defeat. By Greek custom, the side that asked for a truce to recover bodies was admitting they had lost the field. Epaminondas, magnanimous in victory, granted it. He did not pursue the fleeing Spartans into the hills. He did not need to. The message had been sent. The myth had been shattered. Sparta was not invincible. The Sacred Band of Thebes, 300 lovers who refused to break, who fought with a courage born not of discipline but of love, had done what no army in 300 years had accomplished. They had annihilated Sparta. News of the Battle of Leuctra spread across Greece like wildfire. Runners carried the message to every city-state. Merchants and travellers spread the story in taverns and marketplaces. In Athens, people gathered in the agora in stunned disbelief. Sparta, defeated, in open battle, on level ground, with their king killed. It was impossible, but it had happened. In Corinth, in Argos, in Elis, former Spartan allies began quietly reassessing their allegiances. The balance of power had shifted overnight. In Thebes, the victory was celebrated as nothing short of a miracle. Epaminondas and Pelopidas were hailed as heroes, as saviours, as the greatest generals since the days of the Persian Wars. The Sacred Band was showered with honours. Statues were commissioned, poems were written. Young men across Boeotia looked at the Sacred Band and saw not just soldiers, but legends walking among them. But in Sparta, there was only silence and grief. The city that had built its entire identity on military superiority, that had crushed Athens and dominated Greece for a generation, had been humiliated. Mothers and wives wept for sons and husbands who would never return. The city held no public mourning. Spartans were not supposed to mourn, but the grief was palpable. Worse, the loss of 400 Spartiates was a demographic catastrophe. Sparta's citizen population had been declining for decades due to their rigid social system, inequality, and unwillingness to expand citizenship. This single battle had wiped out more than half of their remaining full citizens. They would never recover. The Sparta that marched to Leuctra was not the same Sparta that limped home. Epaminondas did not stop at Leuctra. Over the next 9 years, he led multiple invasions deep into the Peloponnese, the Spartan heartland that had not seen an enemy army in centuries. In 370 BC, he marched his army to the very gates of Sparta itself, something no invader had ever done. Ancient sources say that Spartan women, who had never seen an enemy soldier in their lives, panicked at the sight of smoke rising from burning villages nearby. Epaminondas did not burn Sparta. There was no glory in destroying an empty city, but he did something far more devastating. He liberated Messenia. For over 3 centuries, the Messenians had been enslaved by Sparta. They were called Helot state-owned serfs forced to work the land while Spartan citizens trained for war. The Spartan system depended entirely on Helot labour. Without it, Sparta could not function. Epaminondas freed them all. He founded the city of Messene with massive fortifications, restored Messenian independence, and gave them the tools to defend themselves. Without Messenian agriculture, Sparta's economy collapsed. Without Helot labour, Sparta could no longer sustain its warrior class. The Spartan state, once the greatest military power in Greece, was effectively finished as a hegemon. Thebes, meanwhile, rose to fill the vacuum. For nearly a decade, the Theban hegemony dominated Greek politics. Pelopidas led campaigns into Thessaly and Macedonia, spreading Theban influence across northern Greece. Epaminondas commanded fleets and armies, reshaping the balance of power. The Sacred Band remained the tip of the spear, the elite shock troops feared by every enemy. They remained undefeated. Not once did they break in battle. Not once did they retreat. But hegemony is a fleeting thing in Greece. Power shifts, alliances crumble, and a new threat was rising in the north that would make Sparta's dominance look like a golden age. The kingdom of Macedon, led by a brilliant and ruthless king named Philip II, was beginning to unite the fractious tribes and cities under its banner. And Philip had been watching. He had been a hostage in Thebes during the Sacred Band's rise. He had studied Epaminondas' tactics. He had learned from the Sacred Band, and he was building an army that would conquer the known world. The Sacred Band's greatest test was still to come. If this story of tactical genius, brotherhood, and one of the greatest upsets in military history is blowing your mind, you need to stay locked in. Because this is just Act 2. The Sacred Band's final stand against Alexander the Great is next. And trust me, it's one of the most tragic, heroic, and cinematically brutal endings in all of ancient warfare. Hit that like button if you're loving this deep dive into one of history's most underrated military units. Drop a comment and tell me, could any modern military unit match the Sacred Band's combination of skill, discipline, and unbreakable loyalty? Share this video with anyone who thinks they know ancient history, because I guarantee they've never heard this story the way we're telling it. Now, let's move to their final battle, their last stand, their immortality. For 9 glorious years after Leuctra, Thebes stood as the dominant power in Greece. Epaminondas and Pelopidas became legends, their names spoken with the same reverence once reserved for Sparta's kings, for Leonidas at Thermopylae, for Brasidas at Amphipolis. The Sacred Band remained the elite of the elite, deployed wherever the fighting was fiercest and victory most crucial. They marched into the Peloponnese multiple times, their crimson-plumed helmets and bronze shields becoming symbols of Theban power. They invaded Thessaly in the north, fought in Arcadia, and stood guard as Epaminondas reshaped the political map of Greece. They remained undefeated. Not once in those 9 years did the Sacred Band break in battle. Not once did they retreat. Not once did they fail to accomplish their mission. They were no longer just soldiers. They were a symbol proof that courage, brotherhood, and tactical innovation could triumph over any enemy, no matter how legendary. Young men across Greece whispered their names. Poets composed verses about the lovers who fought as one. Philosophers debated whether their bond was the highest form of virtue. The Sacred Band had become immortal in the minds of their contemporaries, even while they still lived and bled and trained in the barracks of the Cadmea. But empires built on military glory are fragile things, especially when they depend on a handful of brilliant individuals. In 364 BC, catastrophe struck. Pelopidas, leading a campaign in Thessaly against the tyrant Alexander of Pherai, was killed leading a cavalry charge at the Battle of Cynocephaly. He died as he had lived at the front, leading his men, refusing to ask them to face any danger he would not face himself. His death was a devastating blow to Theban morale. The Sacred Band had lost the man who'd commanded them for over a decade, the man who had believed in them when they were just an experiment, the man who had led them to victory at TEGYRA and Leuctra. Then, just 2 years later in 362 BC, came an even more catastrophic loss. Epaminondas, leading the Theban army at the Battle of Mantinea in the Peloponnese, achieved yet another tactical victory using his revolutionary oblique order. The Theban left wing smashed through the enemy line. The Spartans, fighting alongside their new allies, were routed once again. But at the moment of triumph, as the enemy lines broke and fled, Epaminondas was struck by a spear. Ancient sources say he knew immediately that the wound was mortal. He remained conscious long enough to ask if his shield had been recovered. It had, and to ask if the Thebans had won. They had. Only then did he allow the spear to be pulled from his chest. He died on the battlefield, surrounded by his men, victorious but gone. With Epaminondas dead, Theban supremacy died with him. No one else possessed his combination of strategic vision, tactical genius, and moral authority. Without Pelopidas and Epaminondas, Thebes lacked the leadership to maintain its hegemony. The Boeotian League began to fracture. Allied cities drifted away. The city-states of Greece, exhausted by decades of constant warfare, descended into a fractured, uneasy peace where no single power could dominate. Athens rebuilt its naval strength, but remained cautious. Sparta, humiliated and broken, turned inward to nurse its grievances. While Thebes remained powerful, it was no longer feared as it once had been. But the vacuum at the heart of Greece would not last long, for to the north, in the rugged mountains of Macedonia, a new power was rising, led by a king who had learned everything from watching Thebes. Philip II became king of Macedonia in 359 BC, inheriting a backward, tribal kingdom constantly threatened by barbarian invasions from the north and Greek interference from the south. Macedonia was not considered a real part of Greece by most Greeks. It was a frontier kingdom of rough highlands, tough farmers, and hard-drinking warriors who spoke a dialect of Greek that southern city-states mocked. But Philip was no ordinary king. He was a genius on par with Epaminondas, and he'd been given the greatest education any future conqueror could ask for. From 368 to 365 BC, Philip had been held hostage in Thebes, a common practice in Greek diplomacy, where important young men were kept as guarantees of their city's good behaviour. But this was not imprisonment. Philip lived in the house of Pamenes, one of the leading Theban generals. During those 3 years he watched Epaminondas drill his armies. He studied the tactics of the Sacred Band. He saw firsthand how the oblique order worked, how a deep phalanx could break an enemy line, how professional, full-time soldiers would always defeat part-time militias. He learned that warfare was not just about courage. It was about organization, discipline, logistics, and innovation. Philip returned to Macedonia in 365 BC and began to transform his primitive army into the most sophisticated military machine the ancient world had ever seen. He took everything he had learned in Thebes and improved on it. He replaced the traditional 8-foot hoplite spear with the sarissa, an 18-foot pike made of cornel wood that allowed his phalanx to strike enemies from a distance they could not reach. His phalangites pike-armed infantry fought in tightly packed formations, 16 ranks deep, with the first 5 ranks holding their pikes forward, creating a wall of steel that was nearly impossible to penetrate. He created the companion cavalry, elite mounted warriors drawn from the Macedonian nobility, trained to smash through enemy flanks with devastating wedge-shaped charges. He organized his infantry into the hypaspists and pejetairoi professional, full-time soldiers who trained year-round, just like the Sacred Band. He incorporated archers, javelin throwers, and engineers who could build siege towers and catapults, and most dangerously, Philip was a master of combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, cavalry, light troops, and siege engines with a level of sophistication no Greek commander had achieved. He also understood politics and bribery as well as he understood war. He once said that no fortress was impregnable if a mule loaded with gold could get inside. By the mid-340s BC, Philip had conquered Thrace, annexed Thessaly, and begun interfering in Greek affairs under the guise of protecting Greek interests. He presented himself as a champion of Greek unity against barbarian threats, but everyone knew the truth. Philip wanted to dominate Greece the same way Sparta once had, and then he wanted to invade Persia and conquer the East. The question was not if Philip would move against the Greek city-states, but when. By 339 BC, the threat was undeniable. Philip had spent years slowly tightening his grip on northern Greece, manipulating alliances, bribing politicians, and positioning his forces. Athens, the great democratic power whose military strength had declined since the Peloponnesian War, watched Philip's expansion with growing alarm. The brilliant Athenian orator Demosthenes delivered a series of fiery speeches, the Philippics warning that Macedonia posed an existential threat to Greek freedom. He called Philip a barbarian tyrant, a threat to everything Greece stood for. He called for a coalition to stop Philip before it was too late, before the Macedonian army marched south and turned every Greek city into a Macedonian vassal state. Most Greek cities, exhausted and cynical after decades of war, ignored him. They had heard it all before. Every generation had its boogeyman. Persia, Sparta, Thebes and Greece had always survived. But Demosthenes was persistent. He travelled from city to city, building alliances, appealing to pride and fear. And in Thebes, now reduced from hegemon to just another city-state, his words found fertile ground. The memory of past glory still burned in Thebes. They had defeated Sparta. They had changed the world. Could they do it again? The Theban leadership faced a difficult choice. For years, Thebes had maintained a pragmatic alliance with Philip. Macedonia had been useful as a counterweight to Athens and Sparta. But now Philip was demanding more obedience, not alliance. The Theban leadership, convinced by Demosthenes and their own pride, made a fateful decision. They broke their alliance with Philip and joined Athens in a pan-Hellenic coalition against Macedonia. It was a bold move, a desperate move, and it sealed their fate. Philip responded with characteristic speed and ruthlessness. In late 339 BC, he marched his army south into central Greece, bypassing fortified positions and capturing the strategic city of Elatea in Phocis, just a few days' march from both Thebes and Athens. The news sent shockwaves through Greece. Demosthenes was in Athens when word arrived. He later described the panic. Messengers arrived at night. Officials were dragged from their beds. The city erupted in fear. Philip was no longer a distant threat. He was here, at the gates, with an army of 30,000 men. The coalition scrambled to respond. Athens mobilized every hoplite it could muster and sent them north. Thebes mustered the Boeotian League's forces troops from Thebes, Plataea, Thespiae, and other Boeotian cities. Together, they assembled an army roughly equal in size to Philip's, around 30,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. It was an impressive force on paper, but unity was fragile. Many of these men had spent the last generation fighting each other. Athenians and Thebans had been enemies in the Peloponnesian War. Old grudges ran deep, and now they were supposed to stand shoulder to shoulder against the most professional army in the Greek world. And leading the Theban contingent, Holding the most critical position on the right wing were the veterans of the Sacred Band. They were older now. Many of them had been fighting for decades. Grey hair showed beneath their helmets. Scars crisscrossed their arms and legs. Some had lost lovers in previous battles and now fought beside younger partners. But they were still the best, still undefeated, still the Sacred Band. And they were about to face the one man who truly understood them, the man who had watched them train in Thebes 25 years earlier. Philip knew exactly how dangerous they were, and he knew exactly how to kill them. In late summer 338 BC, the two armies met on a broad plain near the town of Chaeronea in Boeotia, not far from the Cephissus River and the low hills that framed the valley. It was less than 40 miles from Leuctra, where the Sacred Band had shattered Sparta 67 years earlier. The coalition forces deployed in the traditional Greek fashion. Athens held the left wing, stretching across the plain toward the foothills. 10,000 Athenian hoplites, many of them young men who had never seen real combat, stood in ranks with their shields and spears. Between Athens and Thebes were contingents from smaller allied cities, Corinthians, Megarians, Acarnanians, less experienced, less motivated, and deeply uncertain about their chances. The Sacred Band of Thebes held the right wing, anchoring their flank against a bend in the Cephissus River, which protected them from being outflanked. It was the position of honour, the critical hinge of the entire line. If the Sacred Band held, the coalition had a chance. If they broke, the entire army would collapse. They knew it. Everyone knew it. 300 men standing in the place where battles were won or lost. Across the field, Philip deployed his forces with calculated precision. He had studied this moment for years. He knew the terrain. He knew his enemies. He knew exactly where each piece needed to be placed. He placed himself on the Macedonian right wing, directly opposite the Athenians, commanding his veteran pike phalanx, the best trained, most disciplined infantry in the world. In the centre, he placed his allied troops and lighter infantry. And on the left wing, facing the Sacred Band, Philip placed his 18-year-old son Alexander at the head of the elite companion cavalry and the high paspist infantry, the absolute best soldiers Macedonia possessed. It was Alexander's first major command in battle. He was not yet Alexander the Great. He was just Alexander, the young prince with something to prove, and Philip had given him the most dangerous assignment on the field: destroy the Sacred Band. If Alexander could break them, the battle was won. If he failed, the entire Macedonian line could collapse. It was a test, a trial by fire. And Alexander, hungry for glory and desperate to prove himself to his father, was ready. The battle began in the early afternoon. Philip struck first, but not with overwhelming force. His right wing, facing the Athenians, advanced in perfect formation, pikes levelled, moving like a single organism. The Athenians, many of them inexperienced, braced themselves for the collision, but then, incredibly, the Macedonians began to give ground, slowly at first, then more noticeably pulling back toward the hills. The Athenian hoplites, seeing the Macedonians retreat, believed they were winning. Cheers went up. Officers shouted encouragement. The Athenian commanders, caught up in the excitement and desperate for glory, ordered a full advance. The Athenians surged forward, shields clashing, spears jabbing at the retreating Macedonians. They chased them uphill, convinced they were about to rout the Macedonian right and win glory that would be sung about for generations. It was exactly what Philip wanted. The Athenian line began to stretch and separate from the centre as they pursued the withdrawing Macedonians. Gaps opened, cohesion broke down. and on the Macedonian left, across the field, Alexander saw it. His father had done his part. Now it was Alexander's turn. With a roar that ancient sources say could be heard across the battlefield, Alexander led the companion cavalry in a thunderous charge directly into the gap between the Athenian and Theban forces. 2,000 horsemen, the finest cavalry in the world, smashed into the exposed flank of the coalition centre like a hammer into glass. At the same time, the Macedonian phalanx in the centre surged forward, their 18-foot sarissas punching through shields and armour, their tight formation crushing anything in their path. The smaller Greek contingents, Corinthians, Megarians and others, who had little personal stake in this fight, broke, almost immediately under the overwhelming Macedonian assault. They had not trained together, they did not trust each other, and now they were being slaughtered. Within minutes the coalition line was split in two. The Athenians, now isolated on the left and exhausted from chasing Philip's feigned retreat, realized too late they had been tricked. They were surrounded. Macedonian phalangites closed in from the front. Cavalry attacked from the flanks and rear. Over 1,000 Athenian hoplites died in the slaughter that followed. Another 2,000 were captured. The Athenian wing collapsed completely. And now Alexander turned his full attention to the Sacred Band. The Sacred Band saw it all unfold. They watched the centre disintegrate. They watched Athens fall. They saw the Macedonian cavalry wheeling toward them, saw the phalanx advancing, saw the trap closing. They knew they were alone, surrounded, cut off from any support. The rest of the coalition was dead, captured, or fleeing. The rational choice, the survivable choice, was to retreat. Withdraw across the river while there was still time. Regroup, live to fight another day. But the Sacred Band did not retreat. They had never retreated. Not at Leuctra, not at TEGYRA, not at Mantinea, not in 40 years of warfare. And they would not start now. To retreat would be to abandon everything they stood for. It would be to admit that love was not stronger than fear. That courage had limits. That honour was negotiable. They could not do it. They would not do it. They reformed their phalanx, shields locked, spears levelled, and prepared to face the Macedonian onslaught. 300 men against thousands, lovers standing beside lovers one last time. The older men glanced at their younger partners, and no words were needed. They had fought together for years. They had trained together, bled together, celebrated victories together. Now they would die together. There was a strange kind of peace in that certainty. No more uncertainty, no more waiting, just one last stand, one last chance to prove that the Sacred Band had never been defeated, only killed. Alexander's forces surrounded them on 3 sides, the river at their back. The Macedonians advanced slowly, methodically, their 18-foot sarissas creating a forest of steel that no hoplite shield could fully defend against. The pikes came from every angle, stabbing, probing, finding gaps. The Sacred Band fought with ferocious, desperate courage. They killed Macedonians by the dozen. Later accounts say even their enemies were stunned by the Sacred Band's resistance at Chaeronea. Their shorter spears darted between the pikes. Their shields deflected blows that would have killed lesser men. They moved as pairs, covering each other, protecting each other, refusing to give ground. But they were fighting mathematics now, not just skill. For every Macedonian who fell, 2 more stepped forward. The Sacred Band's formation compressed, tighter and tighter, as men fell and could not be replaced. The front ranks died first, speared by the Macedonian pikes, their bodies trampled as the phalanx ground forward. The second rank stepped forward into their places and died in turn. No one ran, no one begged for mercy, no one threw down their shields and tried to swim the river. They died standing, shields raised, spears in hand, protecting the man they loved until the last breath left their bodies. Ancient historians record that the battle around the Sacred Band lasted for hours. The sun moved across the sky, shadows lengthened, blood soaked the ground until it was mud, and still the Sacred Band fought. Alexander himself, according to some accounts, was struck by their courage and offered them terms: surrender with honour, live as prisoners, be ransomed. The Sacred Band's answer was silence and another spear thrust. They would accept no terms. They would offer no surrender. This was their choice: death over dishonour, love over survival. As the sun set over the plain of Chaeronea, the last of the Sacred Band fell. Plutarch, the ancient historian who lived in Chaeronea centuries later and walked that battlefield as a boy, recorded what happened next with stark simplicity. The Sacred Band fought to the last man. All 300 fell where they stood. When the Macedonians finally overran the position, stepping carefully over the corpses, they found something that stopped even hardened veterans in their tracks: a circle of bodies, lovers lying beside lovers, shields still locked even in death, hands still gripping swords and broken spears. Some men had fallen across their partners, as if trying to shield them even in death. The most elite fighting force in the Greek world had been annihilated, but they had not been broken. They had chosen death over retreat, honour over survival, and in that choice they achieved a kind of immortality that no amount of gold or marble could buy. After the battle, as the sun set over the blood-soaked plain of Chaeronea and the screams of the wounded faded into silence, Philip II walked among the dead. He inspected the battlefield, assessed the losses, spoke to his commanders, and surveyed the wreckage of the coalition that had dared to stand against him. And then he came upon the position where the Sacred Band had made their final stand. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. 300 bodies still in formation, no scattered corpses, no signs of panic or rout, just a perfect circle of dead men, arranged in pairs, shields touching, facing outward. Men who had fought with such courage, such discipline, such unbreakable loyalty that even their enemies could only stare in awe. Philip stood in silence for a long moment, looking at the bodies of warriors who had refused to surrender even when survival was impossible. Plutarch records that Philip wept. The king of Macedonia, the conqueror who had just secured dominance over all of Greece, the man who had outmaneuvered every Greek statesman and outfought every Greek general, stood among the bodies of the Sacred Band and wept. He reportedly said, "Perish any man who suspects that these men either did or suffered anything unseemly." It was the highest honour a warrior could give to a fallen enemy acknowledgement that they had died with perfect courage and honour. In a world that often mocked male-male relationships or treated them as jokes, Philip was declaring that the Sacred Band's love and loyalty were worthy of the greatest respect. Philip allowed the Thebans to bury their dead with full honours. No desecration, no insult, just respect. On the spot where the Sacred Band fell, the Thebans erected a monument that still stands today. A massive stone lion, over 18 feet tall, carved from a single block of limestone and placed on a stone pedestal. The Lion of Chaeronea. It sits in the place where they died, silent and eternal, guarding the mass grave. Beneath it, in the 19th century, during excavations at the site, archaeologists discovered the remains of 254 warriors buried in 7 rows beneath the monument. Their bones told the story of violent death spear wounds, sword cuts, shattered skulls. But they also told another story. They were buried with care, with honour, together. The Sacred Band was never reformed. The unit that had changed the course of Greek history, that had destroyed Sparta and redefined warfare, died on that August day in 338 BC. But their legacy lived on. Alexander, who had commanded their destruction, carried their lessons with him when he conquered the Persian Empire and marched to the edge of the known world. He understood that the greatest soldiers are not created by threats or fear, but by bonds that transcend orders. The idea of elite professional soldiers bound by loyalty and brotherhood became the foundation of every great army that followed, from Rome's Praetorian Guard to Napoleon's Old Guard to modern special forces. The Battle of Chaeronea marked the end of the classical Greek world of independent city-states. Athens and Thebes, the great powers that had shaped Western civilization, were broken. Philip imposed the League of Corinth on the defeated Greek city-states, making them all technically independent but practically vassals of Macedonia. Only Sparta, humiliated and powerless after Leuctra, refused to join. 2 years later, in 336 BC, Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding by one of his own bodyguards, a murder shrouded in conspiracy theories that remain unsolved to this day. His son Alexander inherited the throne at age 20 and immediately launched the invasion of Persia that Philip had been planning. Alexander conquered an empire stretching from Greece to India, spreading Greek culture across the known world in what would be called the Hellenistic Age. He became Alexander the Great, one of the most famous conquerors in history. But he never forgot Chaeronea. He never forgot the 300 men who had refused to break. Thebes, however, would not submit quietly. In 335 BC, emboldened by rumours that Alexander had been killed in battle in the north, Thebes revolted. They drove out the Macedonian garrison and declared their independence. It was a fatal mistake. Alexander, very much alive, marched back from the Balkans with terrifying speed. He surrounded Thebes and offered terms: surrender, pay reparations, and submit. Thebes refused. Alexander unleashed his army. The city was stormed, sacked, and razed to the ground. 6,000 Thebans were killed. 30,000 were sold into slavery. The temples were burned. The walls were torn down. The city that had defeated Sparta and fielded the Sacred Band was erased from the map. Only the house of the poet Pindar was spared, on Alexander's orders, as a gesture of respect for Greek culture. But the memory survived. The Lion of Chaeronea remained, a silent guardian over the graves of 300 lovers who had changed the world. Their story became legend, passed down through generations, proof that the greatest weapon is not the sharpest sword or the longest spear, but the bond between warriors who fight not just for glory or duty, but for the person standing beside them. The Sacred Band of Thebes rose from oppression, achieved the impossible at Leuctra, and died with honour at Chaeronea against the greatest conqueror the world had ever seen. They were the other 300, and their legacy is eternal. This is the complete story of the Sacred Band of Thebes. From their forging in the fires of rebellion and occupation, to their annihilation of Sparta at Leuctra, to their final, glorious, heartbreaking stand against Alexander the Great at Chaeronea. 300 men bound by love, courage, and an unbreakable refusal to surrender. They rewrote the rules of ancient warfare. They toppled the greatest military power of their age. They proved that innovation and brotherhood could defeat tradition and fear. And they died on their feet, shields locked, protecting each other to the last breath, choosing honour over survival. If this story moved you, if it made you see ancient warfare in a completely new light, If it reminded you that history is not just about kings and empires, but about ordinary people who refuse to be ordinary, then do me a favor. Share this video. Stories like this deserve to be remembered, not buried in forgotten footnotes. Hit that subscribe button and join the Wars in History family. We dig deep into the battles, the tactics, and the warriors that shaped civilization. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. We've got more forgotten units, more impossible victories, more brutal truths coming your way. Drop a comment below and tell me, what other forgotten military units from history should we cover next? The Varangian Guard, the Immortals of Persia, the Mamluks? Let me know. And if you made it all the way to the end of this 80-minute deep dive, you're a true history warrior. Thank you for watching. Remember the Sacred Band. Remember that love, when weaponized, when forged in discipline and tempered in blood, can break empires and change the world. And I'll see you in the next one.